Your name is Tomasso di Camogli, born and raised in the seaport of Camogli, east of the great city of Genoa. But today you're a long ways from home, standing on a muddy field in northern France, your hands squeezing your crossbow in a death grip. Ahead of you, on top of a gentle hill a few hundred meters away, you can see the red, gold, and blue banners of your enemy, the King of England. You swallow hard, and as you steady your feet in the churned up mud, you wonder, how did a man from the Republic of Genoa end up in a war between two foreign kings? Today, on the Warfighter Archives, we'll examine one of the most talked about matchups in military history, the longbow versus the crossbow, focusing on what happened at the Battle of Crécy. This battle is often cited as proof of the longbow's dominance, but that's only part of the story, and in this video, I'll break down the weapons and the soldiers that carried them, while the next video will discuss the battle itself and what tactical conditions led to its outcome. And I'll do this in part through the eyes of Tomasso, our fictional Genoese crossbowman whose fate, like many others, was decided long before the arrows started flying. As Tomasso, you know something that people often overlook, that not all the crossbowmen standing with you are Genoese, and not all the Genoese are crossbowmen. Genoese crossbowmen fought in teams, typically one Pavisarii, a Pavise bearer and spearman, for each 3 crossbowmen, as noted by David Nicolle. Thus, the oft-cited 6,000 Genoese crossbowmen would actually mean either 4,500 crossbowmen and 1,500 Pavisarii, or 6,000 crossbowmen and 2,000 Pavisarii. Moreover, Genoa had also provided the French with a fleet of 32 galleys. Nicolle cites a typical galley as having a crew of around 200 men. How many of these were fighting men is open to debate, since by 1346 the Genoese used a combination of freemen, slaves, and convicts as oarsmen, according to the historian William Rogers. In addition, the French had hired 1,400 Genoese crossbowmen to assist with their Gascony campaign, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. In addition, Genoa itself was at war with the Mongols. In 1346, the Genoese colony of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula was still under siege with a garrison of several thousand soldiers. In addition, Genoese galleys were working with the Venetians to blockade Mongol ports in the Black Sea, and in total these operations probably included at least 5,000 men. It's highly unlikely that Genoa could afford to send an additional 9,000 to 14,000 men, depending on the status of the galley crews, to fight in France. The historian Schnerb agrees, as he believes there's no way Genoa could have raised a force of 6,000 crossbowmen, let alone 9,000 to 14,000. Add to that the fact that this was a hastily raised French army. Earlier that summer, the main French army of 20,000 men, including the best knights and all the officers of the royal household, had invaded Gascony. They had expected the English army to sail south to protect their valuable Gascon territories, so the English decision to land in the north caught King Philip flat-footed. As a result, the arrière-ban, which was an emergency call to arms, was issued on July 29th, just under a month before the Battle of Crécy was fought on August 26th. Tomasso, as a foot soldier, would be the first one to tell you 9,000 Genoese can't march from the Ligurian coast to Rouen in under a month, let alone with the full supply train, which thousands of pounds of salted meat, bread, crossbow bolts, pavises, spare parts, and handlers that such a deployment would have required. Moreover, the arrière-ban likely raised large numbers of crossbowmen as well. We know that crossbows, at least the lighter kind, were ubiquitous across France and that many major towns and cities had their own crossbow maker. We know that a few thousand crossbows were made for the French fleet in 1340, and so it's pretty clear that France produced great quantities of the weapon when needed. David Nicolle also states that crossbowmen were in short supply in France, but I think he's referring to professional crossbowmen. And the arrière-ban didn't just call professionals, it summoned all able-bodied men. And the commoners with crossbows were likely to be the first taken into service, especially since the king had just sent 1,400 expert Genoese mercenaries to Gascony. My personal belief, and feel free to debate me in the comments below, is that there were probably around 6,000 crossbowmen, but only a few of them, maybe 2,000 or so, were Genoese. The rest were likely French levies. This is critical for 2 reasons. First, the levies especially would have had a variety of crossbows with different draw weights and reload mechanisms, and second, this would mean 2 different languages, French and Italian, trying to operate as one cohesive unit. In contrast, the English would have had a more unified command structure, and while there was variation with longbows, it was nowhere near as dramatic. But why would King Philip create this type of linguistic problem? Well, I think David Nicolle's statement about France lacking its own professional crossbowmen makes sense. Simply put, the Genoese captains may have been the only leaders with experience commanding crossbowmen on the battlefield. As Tomasso, such high-level decisions were over your head, but you would certainly feel uneasy about serving alongside so many foreigners whose strange language you can't understand. You'd also feel uneasy serving under Doria, who in 1339 had caused a mutiny by pocketing the wages of his men. Language differences and dishonest commanders are hardly recipes for battlefield cohesion. Moreover, you'd be further unsettled by the absence of the Pavise shield which you rely upon for protection. Your Pavisarii, Enrico, would probably be even more nervous. Without the Pavise, he's just an armored spearman, the medieval equivalent of bringing a knife to a gunfight. Historians have pondered the lack of Pavises a great deal, but there are two simple explanations. Nicolle notes that it was not uncommon for Genoese mercenaries to store the cumbersome Pavises in wagons for the march. This makes sense. Genoese mercenaries were generally very well armored, and the weight of armor and crossbow could add up fast when you're marching 10 to 20 miles a day. If this was the case, then they likely kept their baggage train close at hand so they could retrieve their Pavises quickly if needed. It's also important to remember that the French had set off at speed because King Edward had given them the slip, crossing the Somme and heading north. The French had considered this impossible and so had not bothered to remove crops or valuables from the lands north of the Somme, so when they set out, their primary goal was to move quickly enough to prevent the English from causing more damage to some of the richest lands in France. This is probably why the crossbowmen were in the vanguard. The French would have been concerned with overcoming English rearguard detachments and isolated bands of looters. In this context, a combined arms force of knights and crossbowmen would provide an overwhelming amount of combat power. In addition, if a major battle was joined, the crossbowmen would be expected to form a skirmishing line, meaning that they would need to be on the field first anyway. However, the baggage train fell further and further behind the crossbowmen, and a key factor here is the poor march discipline of the French. Froissart states that, quote, "These kings, earls, barons, and lords of France did not advance in any regular order, but one after the other, or any way most pleasing to themselves." This was probably because the Constable of France, the officer responsible for maintaining march discipline, had been captured at Caen and therefore was not present. Also, the Genoese were tired, having marched for over half the day in full armor with their weapons, and by contrast, the English longbowmen were well rested and prepared. How much of this you know as a common soldier like Tomasso is debatable, as even in modern times, soldiers often don't know all the details of their mission, or why supplies aren't there when they're needed. But certainly you'd feel the cramps and soreness in your legs, as well as the unease over the missing Pavise, much like a modern soldier forced into combat without his body armor. You'd feel even more uneasy as you look up and down the line and see the variety of crossbows that your French allies are sporting. Genoese mercenaries like Tomasso benefited from being equipped by the wealthy city of Genoa, which had its own extensive guild of crossbow makers. Most were probably equipped with windlass crossbows. These weapons were expertly crafted, devastatingly powerful pieces. Each had a metal bow and a draw of 800 pounds or more and a range of around 200 to 250 meters. The downside was that the windlass took time to reload. Even an experienced man like Tomasso would only fire around 2 bolts per minute. This is why the Pavise was so important, as a reloading crossbowman was a stationary, vulnerable target. On the other hand, French levies might bring any variant of crossbow to the battlefield, and many French crossbows might have been lighter variants, some possibly still made mostly of wood. These would have a notably lower draw weight of around 250 to 300 pounds and a range of 100 to 150 meters. On the plus side, most would use a lever or a belt hook to reload, allowing them to shoot faster, maybe at around 6 shots per minute. Honestly, there are other types of crossbows that might have appeared as well, but going over them all would take far too long. Suffice to say that there was significant deviation in the range, speed, and penetrating power of the various types. From this, we see a confused force that lacks cohesion. The crossbow line has a wide variation in draw weight and reload mechanisms, which means that their shooting pace and range can vary pretty dramatically. In addition, there are language issues. If an order is given in Italian, it needs to be translated to French and vice versa. If this doesn't happen, then confusion and misunderstanding can take hold. Combined, these two factors create a lot of inconsistencies, and in battle, inconsistencies aren't just problematic, they can be lethal. This is the most likely scenario in my opinion. However, the other option is that the crossbowmen were all Genoese and were probably only around 2,000 or so in number, meaning they'd be badly outnumbered by the 6,000 to 7,000 English longbowmen. Either way, we know that the Genoese were certainly concerned about the situation. Froissart states that the Genoese told the Count of Alençon, commander of the vanguard, that, quote, they were not in a fit condition to do any great things that day in battle, but Alençon dismissed them coldly as being scoundrels. Some people have pointed to this and said that it makes no sense since the Genoese were highly regarded across Europe, and this is true to some degree. However, it fails to account for the 1339 mutiny where the Genoese had seized control of their galleys and gone home. This act had played a significant role in the deterioration of France's naval fortunes, which culminated in the disastrous defeat at Sluys in 1340. So it's likely that there was substantial bad blood between the two sides, and Alençon's remarks make a lot more sense in that context. But in this video, we've gone ahead and set the stage for the showdown between longbows and crossbows at Crecy, and maybe we've painted the crossbow line in a different light. They were likely a mixed force, professionals and levies, under-equipped and commanded by a man whose claim to fame was stealing pay and sparking a mutiny. Either that or they were badly outnumbered by more than 3 to 1 and still had the same issue with a commander who had a reputation for stealing the men's pay. And they're about to face one of the most lethal volleys of missiles in medieval history. In Tomasso's shoes, you tighten your grip on your crossbow and try to swallow down your fear as the order to advance sounds. You know that your next few minutes could be your last. And in the next episode, we'll look at what happens when the shooting starts. But will Tomasso survive, and if so, is the reputation of his unit and his weapon truly going to be shattered for good? But let me know what you think in the comment section below, and also let me know what you think about this video format with a bit of immersive storytelling. Ultimately, I want my videos to be accessible, debate-provoking, and interesting, and the best ones to help me attain that standard are you, my viewers. With that said, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.